Hi everyone, let me just start by saying that I have a cat now. So if you hear any strange noises or anything like that, then it's the cat. Okay, just wanted to clarify. So with that out of the way, a few years ago there was a documentary about supposedly the truth behind King Arthur or King Arthur's Britain. It didn't really talk too much about King Arthur himself actually. The main part of the documentary was focused on the Anglo-Saxon conquest of what is now England, because that's a fundamental part of the legends of King Arthur. The whole point of the legends of King Arthur is that he was the war leader who led the Britons in the fight against the Saxons. So if the Anglo-Saxon invasion didn't really happen, then that indicates that Arthur himself didn't exist, because the whole fundamental setting of him as a character is actually fictional. That was the idea of the documentary, so most of the documentary was actually spent arguing that the Anglo-Saxon invasion didn't really happen, and that it was more like a mostly peaceful migration and process of cultural exchange, but there was very little actual conquest. So that's an idea that it wasn't just presented in this documentary, it's an idea that's becoming more and more popular recently. But is there really a valid basis for saying this? Well, I think the main problem is a false dichotomy. So a false dichotomy, as I'm sure you know, is where you have you present two options as if they are the only options. So what this documentary was doing, and what many other analyses of this subject do, is that it presented the idea that there was either a total genocide of the native Britons with complete, utter, ravaging destruction, or there was just this mostly peaceful migration with a whole bunch of cultural exchange. It sort of presented it as if those were the only two options. But that clearly isn't true. So when it comes to, for example, the genetic evidence, that was something which this documentary pointed out, that the genetic evidence does not support the conclusion that the Anglo-Saxons completely wiped out the native Britons. In fact, according to the genetic research highlighted in this documentary, the Saxons only formed a very small, or relatively small part of the genetics of the modern English, although more recent research has shown that they make up a much larger part, somewhere between one third and half of the DNA of the English, or at least in ancient times that was the case. So in any case, whether it was as small as this documentary said, or whether it was larger like more modern research indicates, in either case, the fact that the Anglo-Saxons do not make up the overwhelming majority of English DNA doesn't prove that there was never a conquest. Think about it, you could immediately think of countless examples from the ancient world of conquests that did not involve a total replacement of the native population. For example, the Roman conquest of Britain. The Romans left almost no trace whatsoever on the genetics of Britain, and yet that doesn't mean there wasn't a Roman conquest of Britain. Same can apply to the Roman conquest of, well, most of what became the Roman Empire. They didn't replace the populations. The Roman Empire wasn't made up of people born in Italy, or descended from people born in Italy. It was made up primarily of the local populations, but they came to be dominated by the Romans. So the same thing could just as well apply to the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain. There's no reason to present this false dichotomy that either the Anglo-Saxons completely wiped out the native Britons, or they didn't conquer anything. That's a complete false dichotomy. Similarly, the supposed lack of evidence of destruction can also be understood in a similar way. There's no reason to believe that if the Anglo-Saxons conquered Britain, or what now has become England, that they must have done so by completely ravaging all the settlements in the area. That's not how conquests work much of the time. For example, again, thinking about the Roman conquest of Britain, some of it was done through the defeat and destruction of actual settlements, but most of it was done by defeating armies in pitched battles, or even by whole tribes just capitulating to the Romans. So again, similar things could have happened in the Anglo-Saxon conquest. Whole sections, whole populations could have just capitulated to them, or their armies could have been defeated in pitched battles and then the settlements just fell into their hands. So this whole idea that, archaeological evidence doesn't show widespread destruction around Britain at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, so the Anglo-Saxon invasion must be false, that just doesn't work. So is it really valid then to say that because of the genetic evidence and the lack of widespread destruction, that we can say that the Anglo-Saxon invasion never happened? Well, no, I don't think so. And what I think is really important and cannot be ignored is the Gallic Chronicle of 452. So this was written in, as the name suggests, 452, the 5th century. It is a perfectly contemporary chronicle. Not a near contemporary chronicle, but a perfectly contemporary chronicle of events in the mid-5th century. And it records that in the year 441, Britain had fallen into the hands of the Saxons. So this is a contemporary record that confirms that the Anglo-Saxon takeover of Britain was not a case of just cultural exchange or peaceful migration, but it was a case of conquest. A peaceful migration would not lead to someone on the continent writing that Britain had fallen into the hands of the Saxons. So any argument for just cultural exchange or peaceful migration cannot address the contemporary evidence. And there's also another contemporary document, also from the 5th century, the life of Saint Germanus, which describes a war or a battle between the native Britons and the Saxons, again in the 5th century. So there are at least two contemporary records from the 5th century that describe, one describes a warfare between the Britons and the Saxons, the other describes Britain falling into the hands of the Saxons. So I think the evidence is clear from the contemporary documentary evidence that there was an Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain, and the evidence from archaeology and the evidence from genetic research is not inconsistent with that in any way. And in fact, the linguistic evidence strongly supports a matter of conquest rather than one of peaceful migration, because it's very, very difficult to wipe out all linguistic traces of a population, and yet that is pretty much what the Anglo-Saxons were able to do. There are almost no traces, there are a few, but there are almost no traces of Brythonic in Old English, and certainly not in modern English. And yet, if there was just this peaceful integration, well, then it's very normal for there to be loads of loan words being exchanged between the languages, and also grammatical influences as well. And yet we see almost no influences whatsoever of Old English in Welsh and of Brythonic in Old English. And yet that's exactly what we would expect if there was severe conquest, but it's not what we would expect if there was just semi-peaceful migration and cultural exchange. So on the basis of that evidence and the contemporary evidence and the fact that the archaeological evidence and genetic evidence is consistent with it, I think that the conclusion that is best supported by the evidence is that there was in fact an Anglo-Saxon conquest, and therefore the whole background to the setting of Arthur is definitely historical.